right, Professor. Thank you very much for being here. It's a great honor.
Great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Great to meet you, and also a huge thanks to Frederick University and Christophoros that arranged this. I will not make an introduction about you because there are so many things to say and I don't know where to start and where to end. You are here because of the event at Frederick University. The university will honor you with an honorary doctorate for your significant contributions to global sustainable development and your effective interventions in addressing complex challenges faced by humanity. This will take place tomorrow on Friday, 2nd of May in Nicosia, and will be broadcasted live. And the President of the Republic will be there. Have you ever met our President?
I have briefly at the UN and also some of his predecessors, so I've been privileged to come to Cyprus on many, many occasions.
Yes. And, so it's your 5th visit now, Professor?
I think it's around my 5th visit.
Yes.
I was affiliated for many years as an advisor on the advisory board of the Cyprus Institute, which is a wonderful institution. And I have many friends across the island, many colleagues from the United States, Cypriots who have returned here. And so it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be back.
And it's great for us to have you as well. So I have been following you for many years now. And I remember the first time I listened to you, I thought that this person embodies in my mind what the common sense is all about. I mean, the things you were saying made such common sense to me, which is absent, at least from politics and now from the markets. I mean, doing the simple things and what is common sense things to do.
I think the point, I hope, that I tried to accomplish is to identify the common good rather than a very partisan perspective. So I think the main point is that everybody has an angle. Every country, it's trying to get rich, it's trying to gain more power, it's trying to win a war. There's so much propaganda around. Governments operate by narrative. They don't operate by truth. This is rather obvious. So I like to try to explain not from the point of view of the United States, my country, for example, or the point of view of any particular country, but as objectively as possible. Almost every debate has two sides to it, not just rhetorically, but substantively. The idea that there's one side that's good and the other side that's evil is propaganda. The idea that life is more complex, that there's a history, that if one understands the history, one can appreciate the arguments on both sides, and that solutions do not come through war, through conflict, through propaganda. Solutions actually come through dialogue, through mutual benefit, through negotiation. That's what I espouse.
So I have structured the discussion, Professor. Your visit here marks the 100 days of the Trump presidency, the 2.2. And as you have said on other occasions, during these 100 days, there has been a fundamental change in U.S. economic policy and in the financial policy, in the economic policy. So, and we are living these changes in all fronts, in Ukraine, in the economy, in Palestine. So I want our discussion to evolve around this theme. And today also is the 21st anniversary of Cyprus's accession to the EU, which is another landmark for us.
Absolutely.
And I want to start with the tariffs, if I may, and ask you, what is the economic rationale behind the tariffs?
Well, there is no sound economic rationale. In other words, Trump's tariff policy is fundamentally a mistake for the United States. there are several rationales that are given.
There is no economic backing or theory behind this. I mean, the whole idea with the deficit.
There is backing and there's theory, but it's bad backing and bad theory. And that is why it has caused major consternation inside the U.S. and internationally. There are very, very few friends and supporters of Trump's trade policy anywhere inside the U.S., even in particular economic sectors, even among his donor group. Basically, this is very idiosyncratic. It's linked to Trump. It's linked to a set of ideas that are not correct. Mm-hmm. But, presidents have bad ideas. Leaders have bad ideas. Mm-hmm. They sometimes pursue them. So what are Trump's ideas? Trump's ideas are mixed motives. One is a very clear one, that he likes to threaten others, even those he wants to cooperate with. He thinks that if you want to strike a deal, the first thing you do is you make a threat. This is true of his friends, his allies, and his enemies, because the idea is meet the other side, smack them in the face, and then say, I want to be your friend. And this is a mode of operation that many find bewildering. I don't find it a very effective approach. Of course, I've never been a New York real estate investor, but I have been involved in geopolitics for a long time, mm-hmm. and I don't believe this is the right approach, mm-hmm. but it's Trump's approach.
Yes.
So one is simply power, intimidation and power. Mm. He believes that the U.S. market is so central, so vital, that he can threaten the rest of the world. China, of course, begs to differ. You threaten us, okay, we retaliate. And that's what gets you into very dangerous grounds when you have mutual escalation mm-hmm. of the two largest economies of the world. That is the first thing that's happening. There's a second economic idea, which is an absurd one, and that is that the U.S. trade deficits prove to Trump that other countries are ripping off the United States. So if the U.S. buys more from another country, then that country imports from the U.S. Somehow that country is taking advantage of the U.S. This is delusional, strange, weird. It is as if you go to the shop, you have a credit card, you blow your credit card debt on some wild purchase, and then you blame the shop for your trade deficit. Yes. This is pretty much the U.S. position. The U.S. overspends. The tariffs
won't fix the trade deficit.
The tariff, by the way, will not fix the trade deficit mechanically, because if you raise the tariff, mm-hmm. what happens is you shift U.S. demand to U.S. goods that would otherwise be exported. You price your own goods out of the international markets, and other countries retaliate. Mm-hmm. So you don't end up changing the trade balance, you just end up ruining the trading system. Now, the idea of the trading system is that countries trade with each other because they have relative or comparative advantages. Some do certain things well, others mm-hmm. do other things relatively well. And you get goods more cheaply when you import the goods that other countries do relatively well.
Yes.
I hope Trump, for example, does not keep high tariffs on African countries, because I need my coffee in the morning. And if we try to grow coffee in Central Park, first, the coffee is going to be miserable if it grows at all. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive because there'll be a few beans for all those Starbucks across the United States. So that's comparative advantage. I'd rather buy the coffee from Ethiopia or from Uganda or from Guatemala, from Brazil, and so forth. Well, Trump doesn't understand any of that. So that's the second argument. Mm-hmm. The third argument is that this is the way to reindustrialize the United States. There are many, many incorrect assertions about this as well. First, the United States did not deindustrialize the way people think. The United States shed employment in manufacturing, but if you go to an auto factory, you know why. There are no workers there, but the factory is there, the robots are there.
Yes.
And this is true across manufacturing in the world today. You can bring back a big industrial facility and almost no jobs go with it anymore because of robotics, because of AI systems, and so forth. So Trump already in his first term, what you would call Trump 1.0, tried these tariffs. It had minimal effect on employment in manufacturing. We used to have 19 million manufacturing jobs. Now it's 13 million. And in the meantime, the workforce grew. But that's because these are jobs that went to automation to a large extent, and to the extent that they went to low-income places for the labor-intensive parts, what they did was make the rest of U.S. manufacturing more efficient. Now Trump apparently wants to push U.S. workers into lower-wage jobs that are the low-wage, labor-intensive, relatively low-skilled jobs abroad. Is that going to raise American living standards? It's ridiculous. So that's another rationale. Since it doesn't make sense, it's not fair for you to ask me why. And I'm joking, of course, because there is no why fundamentally. The why is in Donald Trump's head.
Yeah.
And, you know, America does many strange things economically. America brought you the 2008 financial crash. That was a bad idea of the U.S. government that on one day, on September 14th, 2008, the U.S. pushed a major investment bank into a kind of forced bankruptcy rather than merging it. That was an idea. The idea was stupid, and the idea created a global financial panic. Well, what we have now is another idea. God help us, another American idea, and this one also a bad one.
What strikes me, Professor, can one person do this in a country like the United States, where you have institutions, you have Congress, you
such
have
a great question.
You have the universities. This is like one person idea. I mean, how
Yes.
did it pass?
This is a phenomenal point. The thing about Trump is, first of all, he is a symptom, not just a cause. The symptom is a long-term decline of American political institutions. So he's the lagging indicator, if I put it that way, because if you look at the public opinion in the United States and ask, do you trust Congress? If you don't get a huge laugh out of the response, what you'll get is not at all out of the response. Americans do not trust our institutions. Why? They're corrupt. They don't behave according to any proper transparency and procedures. This has been going on for decades. I diagnose this as having two main causes that are distinct. One is the sheer financial corruption of the political system. American politics works by campaign funding. The 2024 election at the federal level was a $16 billion affair. That means that Elon Musk and his friends gave a lot of money to elect Donald Trump.
It's like buying seats.
They buy the seats of the members of Congress. They bankroll the campaigns of presidents, and they say afterwards, we paid for you, now you give us tax cuts, deregulation, special privileges, monopoly rights, inside contracts, whatever you want. So that's one part of American politics. The other part of American politics is that the United States is what the British Empire was for 200 years, between 1750 roughly and 1950. It was the world's hegemonic power. And now the United States has been that for 75 years. That means that the United States acts like an empire. What does an empire do? It uses brute power to get its way. It cheats, it lies, it steals, it manipulates. Yeah. And that's what empires do. And the United States became an imperial state after World War II. And that means, for example, throughout our legislation is the word emergency, because an imperial state needs emergency rule. So Trump, in all of these executive decrees, is invoking emergency rule. When you think about the United States, emergency rule doesn't come first to mind. You think about Congress and the courts and the presidency. But because the U.S. is an imperial state, there is, in fact, emergency powers throughout legislation. Now, my own view is that Trump is just laughably abusing the emergency powers. What is the emergency that caused him to put on the tariffs? Two. One, he claimed there's an emergency of fentanyl, a narcotics emergency, an emergency. So he upends the trading system with China, with Mexico, and Canada, declaring it a fentanyl emergency. This is bogus. This is not a real explanation. This is probably an inside laugh inside the White House. Then he declared the trade deficit an emergency. Well, that's interesting. The trade deficit has been going on for 25 years. It could go on for a while longer. It's hardly an emergency. It's a feature of our political, fiscal, financial, monetary, economic institutions. It should be addressed by law. It should be addressed by Congress. But he declared an emergency, and single-handedly, he is upending the world trade system. Shocking. Now, you might say, extraordinary. How can this be?
Yes.
And it is the degradation of politics. For example, the Congress really is pathetic. They just voted yesterday to whether the Senate would claim its constitutional authority. And they said no. So what happened was
that proposition by Senator Warren?
Exactly. So Trump,
it was rejected eventually?
So the Democrats, basically, with 3 Republicans, voted to state, and I don't know even the legalities because I've been traveling, but voted that Trump's invocation of emergency powers was unjustified.
Okay.
And exactly statutorily what they were claiming to do, I can't tell you. But the idea was that the Congress should say, you're usurping our power.
Yes.
But almost all the Republican senators just followed the Republican president. Why? 2 reasons. One, the institution itself has no self-pride at all. It is not respected by the American people, and it doesn't respect itself. It's a little bit like the Roman Senate after the empire came to be. Yeah. You know, Rome went from a republic to an empire in 27 BC. One could say a bit earlier, in fact. But the Senate, they continued to wear the toga and they continued to prance around, but they had no power anymore. That's like the U.S. Senate. And they have no pride anymore. So they can't even stand up for their own authority. In the House of Representatives, it would probably be even worse. Now, it's also the fact that Republicans who buck the president, who say, no, I don't agree with this imperial approach to power, are likely to face a challenge in the next election. And Elon Musk, for example, has said he will bankroll candidates to defeat those who don't follow the president's line. So that's sheer money talking. The richest man in the United States saying, I will put my money behind candidates to defeat anyone that doesn't follow Trump's line. So This is politics.
So, Professor,
that doesn't work.
You are not describing a democracy. You are describing a plutocracy.
That's exactly right. This is a plutocracy, and it's been a plutocracy for a long time, but it's just become more and more brazen. And Americans are not happy. If you ask the American people, is the United States moving in the right direction? The typical answer in recent years is 20% say yes, and about 80% say no. If you ask about Trump's approval rating right now, he's just 100 days into office.
It's 40%.
40%, 38%, 52 to 55% disapproval. This is not a mandate. Trump says, I have a mandate. I won the election. Believe me, I think everyone knows because it's not so different in Europe. Elections are not based on ideas at all. There's no mandate. You vote for miserable candidate A or miserable candidate B, and then when miserable candidate A or B wins, they say, I have a mandate to do any stupid policy C, D, E, and F. That's not a mandate.
Professor, what about China? What about the response of China? I'm talking about tariffs. Do you see China rising as a superpower, or is it already a superpower?
China's obviously a superpower, a country that has an output in manufacturing that is 2 or 3 times larger than the United States, a country whose overall GDP is at least equal to the U.S. and by some measures 30% larger. And just to note, there are big measurement problems comparing 2 complex economies, but basically it's a huge economy, a country that has hundreds of nuclear weapons, a country that has advanced technologies in every single sphere, in biotech, in artificial intelligence, in every digital technology, in quantum computing, in space exploration, you name it, China's there. Of course it's a superpower. And it's a proud superpower. And it's proud of what China has accomplished. And it's important, since every country has historical memory. China went through an absolutely miserable century from 1839, when the British showed up and launched an outrageous war with China to force the Qing dynasty to open China to British opium, British merchants selling Indian opium. That was 1839, the start of the first Opium War, up through the Japanese invasions in the 20th century, which finally culminated in a civil war between 1945 and 49, and the victory of the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao, and the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And I recount all that history for one overwhelming reason. It's completely fresh in the minds of Chinese leaders, and their main point is, do not bother us again, as you did in what they call the century of humiliation. And they're telling the rest of the world, we want to be peaceful, we want to trade, we want to recover, we want to catch up, we want to be a leader in technologies. Do not bother us in our internal affairs again, like you did for a century. And then things can be fine. But if you bother us, things are not going to be fine.
Yes.
Now, the United States, being kind of the British Empire of the early 21st century, says, to heck with you. You think you're so big, we're bigger. That's what they think. This is foolish. It's reckless. It's stupid. And it's dangerous. So we're in a very dangerous game of chicken right now.
Yes, but from the American perspective, what is the Chinese threat? Why is America so much worried about China? And even Trump, Rubio, they say it's the next thing that we need to focus on China, and China is the threat and everything.
Fundamentally?
Is it a military threat? Is it the economic threat? What is it?
Racism. It is a different culture, a different society. It's big, and it's not understood in America. These leaders know almost nothing about China. I've been going to China now for 44 years, and typically many times each year. I've had students, I have colleagues, I have joint projects, I have studied China, I've traveled all over China for decades. The American leaders know nothing. They're ignorant, but they know China's dangerous. That's what they know.
That's what they say.
And where does that come from? Yes. Well, there's been the yellow peril, as it was once called in the 19th century. We wouldn't use such a vulgar term right now, perhaps. But believe me, this is just fear. And it's fear driven by the other, and it's a deeply human trait, but it's contemptible among leaders of powerful countries to be so ignorant. But the United States leadership is ignorant. China is not a threat, period. It doesn't want to be a threat. It wants absolutely to live peacefully with other countries. It arms itself because the United States has packed all of the countries on its border with the military, from Japan, Guam, Philippines, Korea, bases in the Indian Ocean, all along China's trade routes. You can read U.S. documents that talk about the U.S. choke points on China's sea lanes. And then when China reacts and says, oh, we're going to build up our Navy, you say, you see, they're a militarist danger. Yeah. This is a kind of game. But I don't know if it's a game or just ignorance or human instinct. It's a mix. But basically, why does the United States hate China? Because China's big and successful. That's all.
And you think China will overtake the United States in terms of economic power? And
one thing I can say categorically, with no doubt, China will not invade the United States of America. China will not threaten the security of the United States of America unless the U.S. provokes a war. And this is the most basic point. China cannot defeat the United States. The United States cannot defeat China. That's the basic fact of life on our planet. The same is true with Russia. Russia cannot defeat the United States. The United States cannot defeat Russia. China cannot defeat Russia. Russia cannot defeat China. I'll add in India to the mix.
Yes.
There's a basic truth of major powers that are nuclear armed. They cannot defeat each other, but they can end the world if they try. And so the main lesson of our time is stay out of each other's backyards so you don't get into war. But the Americans don't understand that. And by the way, they learned it from the British, who was in everybody's backyard and annoyed everybody in the world. And the Americans follow that course.
Now, a lot of this of the American behavior is based on the power of the dollar. And you have said recently, you have predicted that this privileged position of the dollar will soon come to an end, right? So this is how you see things moving.
It is coming to an end. And we saw it a couple of weeks ago when the so-called reciprocal tariffs were imposed, and there was nothing reciprocal about them. So this is another narrative of the U.S., in other words, propaganda, not substance, because it wasn't that the U.S. put on the tariff that the other side put on. It was the U.S. concocted some crazy formula based on the trade imbalance and put on the tariff. But that's a side point.
Yes.
the main point is that when this was done, in usual global crises, the dollar would strengthen, interest rates in the U.S. would go down. Why? Because the U.S. was the safe haven. When in doubt, rush to the dollar. Of course, what happened this time, which is why Trump removed the tariffs or postponed them, was that money flowed out of the United States, the dollar weakened, and U.S. interest rates rose. In other words, we're getting out of here.
Yes.
And that's the opposite of a safe haven.
It is, yes.
And so we're already seeing the shift from the dollar as the safe haven to a search for alternatives.
About the response of Europe, Europe has been an ally of the United States. This policy started after the Second World War, so it's been so many decades now. This has suddenly changed. How do you assess the response of Europe as regards the tariffs? And there has been like a period in European leaders that they didn't know what to do, how to react. I mean, we saw this. What would you advise?
Yeah, Europe is several things. So even the word is not so clear, because obviously Europe in part is the European Commission or the European Council. But Europe is also obviously 27 independent countries that are all over the map. Some friends with Trump, some not friendly with Trump, some in NATO, some not in NATO. And the divergences in Europe are becoming larger because the policies that Europe is following are not supported by the public, and they're not effective. And the war in Ukraine is an example of that. Across Europe, public opinion is, stop this already. We don't want this war to continue. Yes. And yet you look at the words of the heads of government, like Macron or Starmer, though he's not in the EU, but the EU heads of state, other than Orban and Fico, generally they're all pro-war. So they're not aligned with their own publics. So we have Europe meaning many different things. We have public opinion, which doesn't count for very much in Europe, strangely enough. Even when elections come, the idea is that the mainstream parties all align together to block any change from of different points of view. You have the European Commission, which tries to dictate, but it doesn't in any event have the authority to dictate. You have, I would say, the Europe of NATO, which until Trump was quite comfortable. Follow the U.S. line, do whatever the U.S. says. Now it's completely bewildered because the U.S. is saying we want to stop the war, but all of these politicians were pro-war until just weeks ago, and they don't know how to get off get out of the war mentality. So all in all, the situation in Europe is not good.
It's chaotic, I would say. It's chaotic.
Yes.
There is no destination, no direction.
One of the things that is very sad is that there are very few leaders in Europe that have a broad support. Macron is approval rating of 20%. Starmer, again in the UK, an approval rating of a little over 20%.
Yes, Macron. You disclosed recently discussion you had with Macron about NATO.
Well, I said to him that, look, Mr. President, I said very respectfully, Mr. President, the expansion of NATO to Ukraine was the causus belli. It was the reason we came into war. And he said, yes, I agree with you. Yes, I agree with you. And then he says the opposite in public, of course, and French policy is exactly the opposite.
Yes.
I don't know what he really believes of those views, but I heard one thing and he does another thing, and I know that divergence is actually widespread For example, my complaint about the Ukraine war for a long time was that the U.S. is provoking it because Russia basically has one idea. Don't come close to our border. Thank you, United States. You are a threat. You have missile systems. We don't want you in Ukraine. Okay. Just to say, if Russia ever tried to put such missile systems in Mexico or Canada, as it once did in Cuba, we'd be at the brink of nuclear war in a moment. The U.S. does not believe in reciprocity, period. So it never is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's do what we say, not what we do. Okay, having said all of that, I know that European leaders generally understand this fact, but they don't say it to their own people.
Yes.
And I know it because I have discussions with them. And they say, oh, Jeff, you know NATO's not really going to enlarge to Ukraine. And I say, well, yes, so why don't you tell your own public that? And they say, oh, that's an interesting point.
But, Professor, you have a unique perspective about the history of Europe, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you have often referred to the NATO project, the NATO expansion project. You have been advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin. You assisted Estonia implement its currency, and also you were advisor to Poland. So you know very well the history and the dynamics of the region. And I would like you to tell us the story from 1990 onwards, because in our part, and I mean Europe, we don't often hear this version of events, as I have heard you many times, to describe. After 1990, the promise that was given to Yeltsin from Thatcher, from...
The basic idea is straightforward. Gorbachev was a man of peace, a remarkable man of peace. We had a Cold War between two nuclear superpowers, and one of the leaders said, I want peace. I don't want this Cold War to continue. As soon as he said that, the old order ended because, of course, the countries in which the Soviet troops sat in Central and Eastern Europe didn't want the Soviet domination. They immediately said, we want our independence, we want an end to the Cold War. And incidentally, and I know it firsthand, Gorbachev facilitated that. And it's almost unknown and unappreciated, including by the Poles, for example, whom I advised very intensively for several years. Gorbachev brokered the turn to power of Solidarity, of Lech Wałęsa, of the non-communist opposition. Gorbachev made that possible to happen peacefully. This is remarkable. And, of course, he gets no understanding or credit for it, least of all in the former Soviet Union, where he's regarded as a kind of an economic bumbler. But he was the greatest statesman of our time, a man of peace. Then comes the United States. If you hear that your adversary says, we end our side of the Cold War, there are two basic responses you could take. One is you could say, okay, we do the same thing, and now we cooperate together. The other is you say, oh, they back down, we win. And not only do we win, we're going to pick up all the pieces on the board. That is what effectively the United States decided. The Soviet Union ended, that's our victory. We get all of the winnings. So rather than treating the late Soviet leadership with respect and cooperation, or even the new Russian leadership of President Yeltsin at the end of 1991 onward with respect and cooperation, the United States almost immediately went into victory mode. And by victory mode, the idea was, we don't have to deal with Russia anymore. It's weak. It's on its back. It's pretty powerless. We don't want the nukes going off. But other than that, we don't have to listen to anything Russia says. One of the things before those events of the final days of the Soviet Union that happened was the reunification of Germany in 1990. I was a witness to all of this close up because I was advising the Polish government, so I saw a lot. I met Chancellor Kohl. I met the German leadership. I discussed with them many things around this time. To reunify Germany was the final act of World War II. Legally, World War II didn't end until the reunification of Germany in a treaty in 1990. The basis of that treaty was an understanding, and it was very clear. And it was February 7th, 1990, expressed by the U.S. Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister to President Gorbachev. You have ended the Warsaw Pact alliance. We will guarantee that we will not take advantage of you, and we will not enlarge NATO.
Yes.
And then, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States did exactly the opposite. And there is a quite, I'm going to use the word wonderful, it's a weird word for this, but a very insightful television show that is posted online that people can find of an interview of Henry Kissinger in 1994, debating with the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union, a very fine diplomat named Jack Matlock. And in 1994, the show was on the question, should NATO enlarge? And Jack Matlock said, no, we have reached peace. We shouldn't provoke a change. We should have normal relations. We should build trust, and so forth. And Kissinger said, yes, NATO should enlarge. And the interviewer asks him, well,
why?
Mr. Kissinger, why? And he says, well, we can. And the interviewer says, is Russia a threat? No, Russia's not a threat. Then why should it enlarge? And Kissinger says, well, we can. And the interviewer says, well, will this antagonize Russia? He says, yes. And the interviewer says, well, why would we do this? And Kissinger says, well, if you can't antagonize them when they're weak, what are you going to do when they're strong? And that mindset, which is, of course, we're going to antagonize Russia. You can't even entertain the idea that we would just cooperate.
Yes.
Is the mindset of the U.S., which is,
Cowboy.
we won, they lost, of course we expand. They will get mad. We don't care. And that was the game played until basically now. Now, what is strange, by the way, and one could elaborate for hours, because the U.S. expanded NATO in stages, and the Russians kept saying, don't come closer, and that's a red line. And the United States kept saying, we don't even hear you. You're nothing but a third-rate power. We don't care what you say. That's effectively what the so-called diplomacy was. And Europe pretty pathetically, privately knew this was a bit dangerous, but publicly always aligned with the United States, our great protector, our great benefactor. And we walked into the Ukraine war. Let me just put it that way, in short. Now Trump says, I don't care. I don't like NATO. I don't want to do this.
I'm out.
I'm out. And he's right. And what did the Europeans say? Who know better? I'm convinced, I'm told, no, they don't know better. They're just dumb. I don't know. I think they know better. They say, no, NATO must enlarge to Ukraine. Do they really want to blow up all of Europe? Can they really not hear? Can they really not imagine Russia's opposition to this? When NATO missiles are being fired deep inside Russia, Do they lack the imagination to know that that pisses off Russia, to have NATO missiles fired deep inside Russia, and not just fired by the Ukrainians? We know it, fired by the British, fired by the U.S., because those missile systems cannot be managed by the Ukrainians. This is all known. Can the European leaders figure this out? So far, no.
Yes. So the first conflict, let's say, after 1990 was the war in Serbia, right?
1999.
In the 1990s,
Yes.
yes. And then we had the bombardment of Belgrade, we had Kosovo, and then the Ukraine.
Well, just to say something about
Yes.
that, just for one moment.
Which again was an intervention, right?
Well, yes. I mean, in 1999, for 78 straight days, NATO bombed Belgrade. I'll say it again. NATO bombed Belgrade 78 straight days. I'd call that intervention. I would not call that subtle. I would remind people that Belgrade is in Europe. Belgrade is on the Danube. Belgrade is part of Europe. This was NATO. And after 78 days of bombing, the U.S. broke Serbia apart and declared that Kosovo was now an independent country, recognized Kosovo in 2008, as did European countries. And then Europe has the audacity to say, borders are sacred. We can never accept Russia's aggression.
Violation of integrity.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, why did you recognize Kosovo? Thank you very much. And then just an interesting point about Kosovo. Where is the largest NATO military base in Southeast Europe? It's Bondesteel, Kosovo. It's not even an accident. It's not even subtle.
Yes.
You break the country apart, and then you put a major NATO military base, and then with a straight face you say that borders are sacrosanct. If we don't get beyond this level of immaturity, we cannot survive. And this is where I think AI is helpful, because if you ask Perplexity or ChatGPT about any statement of a European leader, it will be clear that it's a lie, because ChatGPT remembers the data. If I use Perplexity, it will give you the footnotes.
Yes.
And then you will know, no, it's not the first border change of Europe. That happened to be Serbia.
Yes.
And so artificial intelligence is better than human intelligence in this regard, because it remembers the footnotes, the data sources, and it is not.
Reminds us
exactly
of the events. So we go to Ukraine in February 2014 and the coup with Viktor Yanukovych. And you have said repeatedly that this was a U.S. orchestrated event. And of course, on the other hand, there is the version that Yanukovych stopped the negotiations with the EU. He became pro-Russian and so forth. So
let me just make it simple.
Yes.
If there's a protest in Nicosia, or if there's a protest in Paris, or there's a protest in London, and major Russian politicians come and urge the crowds on, would that be acceptable, or would that be viewed as rather odd?
Yes.
Well, in the Maidan, we know, because it's you just go search the websites. Our senators went to the Maidan to urge on the crowds. That by itself is obnoxious and disgusting. Of course, that's the superficial part, because the CIA and USAID and National Endowment for Democracy and some major NGOs organize the mass media, train protesters, pay protesters. These are concocted, expensive events. I hope everyone understands this. These are not spontaneous events. It's not just the Maidan. This is how U.S. foreign policy works. That is one of the reasons why Trump shut down USAID right away, because it was a conduit for basically it did other things, but one of the things it did was a lot of propaganda for color revolutions, for unrest, for insurrections. I saw a bit of it close up. I've seen American coups close up. It's disgusting, and it's not even subtle. What makes it difficult, though, is the newspapers don't report it. The reporters sit there with their thumbs in their mouth. They don't really want to ask any questions. They don't try to investigate. But it's not subtle if you're really watching.
But soon after Yanukovych was overthrown, you were invited to Ukraine.
Yes, so I was.
To advise. And
the new government asked me to come. I came for one day to speak with them. I didn't do anything more.
Yeah.
But when I got there, I was shown directly, even people bragging, "Oh, look at the revolution we helped pay for by American people." So, you see these things you don't even want to see because it's so gross. And I went for a day, and I got on an airplane, and I went home because I wasn't interested in
participating
in the situation.
in all
Exactly.
This. And then the Crimea War took place, and the annexation. I mean, after Yanukovych.
That wasn't a war. That was just
yes.
an annexation. And that also should be understood. First, there was a referendum, and no doubt because it was overwhelmingly ethnically Russian. I have no doubt that the public there said, yeah, we want to be part of Russia. But there's an obvious deeper text to it, which is that Crimea is strategically significant for Russia because it's where the Black Sea naval fleet is headquartered in Sevastopol. And this has been that way since 1783. And NATO had its eye on Russia's military fleet. No doubt. The idea was, well, in 2014, there's a new friendly pro-NATO government, and who knows, that could become a pro-NATO military base. So the Russians said, hell no, we're not playing this game. You made a coup. We're not giving you our military base. And that's quite straightforward. My point is this, however. Russia has 1,600 nuclear weapons that are actively deployed. The United States has the same number. When we play games, we'll overthrow this government. Maybe we'll take this naval base. That's fine if you're playing a video game or if you're playing a board game. But we're talking about the survival of the planet. And I regard American officials as completely and utterly reckless.
But this policy, Professor, had, when we talk about the deep state in the U.S. and the industrial military complex, there was a whole dogma about this. And you referred many times on Brzezinski's book and the Grand Chess.
Yes.
And, of course, everybody read it. And at the time I was reading it, I thought that I got an inside scoop of how Americans think. And so it's not that like only games. There is a policy behind this. There's a whole document.
But let me put it this
way. Adults just playing.
Well, I would put it a slightly different way. Brzezinski's book is called The Grand Chessboard. So he's viewing the world like a game, in this case, like a game of chess.
Yes.
Okay, that to my mind is already repulsive. I don't like the metaphor.
Yes.
Because chess is a game. You try to kill the other king. But if you play that in real life, by the way, in chess, the most powerful piece is a queen. But the queen is not a nuclear weapon that blows up the whole board. If you played a game of chess and one of the pieces could blow up the whole board before the king was lost, the game of chess would be very different. Brzezinski neglected that fact in 1997. And more than that, he predicted wrongly the most central issue of the whole book. The book outlines why the United States should expand eastward, both NATO and the European Union. And then he analyzes at some length, what will Russia do? And he says, well, Russia will be very unhappy about this, but what will it do? And he says, one thing it could do is accept its fate as a European power, but obviously not in charge. Or it could align with China. And then he reasons everything through and he says, well, it will never align with China. Russia has only a European vocation. So we should push because Russia has no choice. So here's a game, and he's playing a strategy, and he explains his strategy, and his strategy is factually disproven because we played it out in real time. And Russia aligned with China and fought back against the NATO enlargement. And I would say at that point, let's take a lesson. So let's rethink this strategy. Now, I would say the strategy was obnoxious from the beginning. Why did we have to expand NATO? Why did we have to treat the end of the Cold War as a victory rather than as a means of peace? But we played Brzezinski's game. We did it fair and square. It ended up killing or gravely wounding 1 million Ukrainians, perhaps, or more. And it didn't work. So could someone reassess? Now, interestingly, Donald Trump is reassessing. That's impressive. He's reassessing, by the way, on a very intuitive level. I don't know how much of the history he knows or he cares, but his level is very simple, which is this was Biden's war. It's not my war. And Crimea, that was given up under Obama. I don't have anything to do with that. But you know what? As simple as that is, it's basically right, which is Trump is saying, I don't want to play a losing hand. And I should mention the mixed metaphor. Brzezinski called it a chess game. American leaders are not as clever as chess players. What they are is poker players. They're not very good poker players. Poker is a very different game from chess for two basic reasons. First, it's a short-term game. Each hand takes a minute or two. Chess, you play for hours. Americans don't have the attention span for hours. One hand comes, you win or lose, you go on to the next hand, you go on to the next hand. The second point of poker that's very interesting, unlike chess, it's a game of bluff. And Americans are great bullshitters. And so they're good at poker. I got the greatest hand in the world. I'm going to crush you. And this is the game that they play. And they thought, okay, we're going to crush Russia. We're going to threaten to crush Russia. We're going to use the financial nuclear bomb of cutting them out of the SWIFT system. Okay, this is poker.
Yeah.
And the hand was lousy. And Trump is looking at it and he says, I don't even have a pair here, much less a winning hand. And so, but now the Europeans, what are they doing? Don't they get it at this point? But to continue, as Europe says, we're going to fight on to return to the 1991 borders. We'll never accept Crimea being part of Russia. Blah, blah, blah. Do they really want to get Europe completely destroyed in the process?
Yes. Okay, I will put you another perspective, Professor, and it's this. We have international law, right? We have the principle of the sovereignty of nations. We have the United Nations Charter. Russia has clearly violated all this. It has invaded in Crimea in 2014. It has invaded in 2022. So if we accept what you are saying, or not you, what President Trump is saying about Crimea, forget Crimea, it's Biden's, it's an Obama thing. Where does international law stand?
If you want to know which country violates international law most consistently in the world, by far an order of magnitude above the rest, it's the United States of America. Almost everything the United States does in foreign policy these days is illegal. The tariffs are illegal because we have a World Trade Organization system. The United States just walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement, telling the rest of the world to go to hell on this. The United States walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. The United States never signed even and much less ratified most UN major treaties of the last 30 years. The United States,
an invasion, though. It's not like...
And the United States invaded far more countries than Russia ever has or ever will. The Iraq War, where is that? Was that international law?
You,
well, wait a minute. It's not just Iraq. It's Iraq, it's Syria, it's Libya, it's Serbia, it's Afghanistan.
Yes.
Tell me about international law. Tell me.
I'm telling you.
I'm telling you that Russia looks at this and sees a complete imperial behavior by the United States pushing a 900,000-man Ukrainian army on its border and putting missile systems in Eastern Europe. And then you quote international law to me after the United States has invaded and overthrown dozens of governments. Was the coup in Maidan international law? No. That was an absolute threat to Russian security in violation of international law. So my point is the following. Both countries violate international law, but if you want to know who provoked this war, that's the United States. And why do I say that? Because the U.S. has been the powerful country for 30 years, and it has used its power aggressively and illegally. By the way, the U.S. sanctions about half the countries in the world. Those sanctions are illegal. They're against international law. Every year, the UN General Assembly votes that these are illegal. So, yes, if we want to talk about international law, I'm all for it. I love the UN. The United States is the biggest violator of international law, and that is the first point. This was provoked by the world's most powerful country. Now, let's get to peace.
But does it justify the invasion, though, Professor?
It explains it completely.
It explains. I agree with you.
Well,
totally.
justify is not even relevant here. Russia's national security was threatened by the United States deliberately. How's Russia going to act as a great power? It's going to respond. So the United States has to stop provoking wars. It has to stop overthrowing governments. It has to stop covert regime change operations. It has to stop wars of choice.
I agree totally with what you say, and from your perspective as regards realpolitik, but from our perspective as a small country, I'm talking about Cyprus, and as a country that is victim of invasion in 1974, half of the island is taken by Turkey by force. 200,000 people were thrown out of their houses, and we have refugees and everything. Our first line of defense is international law.
I'm explaining to you, there is no international law that's being enforced right now because the U.S. is the biggest violator. Let me give you another example. What's going on in your neighborhood? In Gaza.
Israel. Yes.
A genocide.
It's another.
Okay. A genocide. Who funds, arms, and provides the wherewithal for the genocide?
The US.
The United States. Okay. So Russia's not committing a genocide. The United States and Israel are committing a genocide. Where is the international law? I'm fine about international law, by the way. I spend my life at the UN. I believe it. But I know how things are working right now. The United States acts with impunity, and then to point to Russia as the violator makes no sense. If you point to the United States as the main violator and oh, by the way, Russia does the same in response, I'm with you.
Yes.
That's the point. But, you know, here in Europe, people don't attack the United States. They think, oh, I can't do that. It's dangerous, it's wrong, it's so forth. Oh, they leave it to me, which is not pleasant, by the way. Yes. It's not my favorite activity. But the truth is, we cannot have international law where we point to Russia as the great violator and somehow leave the United States out of the story,
yes,
which provoked everything. So I often say that I'm in favor of Jesus Christ's foreign policy. Jesus Christ's foreign policy is when he says, why do you point to the mote in the other person's eye when you have a plank in your own eye? And what he's saying in the Gospels is, don't be a hypocrite. And that's what I say to the United States and to Europe. Don't be a hypocrite. You want international law? I'm all with you. Completely. Yes. I'm living my life for it. But if you want that, then you have to point to the perpetrator that does it the most. And then you can fairly say, everyone else, this is bad news. But we need the major power to stop this bad behavior. Then we can go on and get everyone else to stop it. But you cannot have the United States acting with impunity and then holding Russia to a standard that puts itself at fundamental national security risk. That's the truth.
Yes. And that's the reality of the situation. And I perfectly understand this. You mentioned the war in Israel. In that, and you are an American Jew, right?
Yes.
So how is it to be so critical against Netanyahu? Don't you get reaction from Israel, from the Jewish community in the U.S.? Because you are very, very critical.
Yeah, look, basically everything I know about Jewish ethics and how I was raised is the opposite of what Netanyahu's doing. So I don't regard what Israel is doing as having anything to do with Judaism. It has to do with extreme nationalism. Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is a nationalist ideology. And Netanyahu is not just a Zionist. He is a vulgar, violent, extremist nationalist. I know he's coming here for a visit. To my mind, he is a danger for the whole world. That's the fact. So I don't regard this as having anything to do with Judaism.
What do you think it's his target in Gaza, to eradicate the Gazans?
Well, he said it. Yeah, they said it the first day.
This plan of President Trump to turn it into...
I don't think that's necessarily real, though it's crazy to have said it. But Netanyahu is very clear. His whole life has been based on one idea, that there will never be a state of Palestine. That's his whole politics from beginning to end. And in 1996, when he came to office as prime minister for the first time, he and his American team concocted something that they called the clean break strategy. And this, again, like many such things, such as Brzezinski's book, explain the strategy straightforwardly. The strategy of clean break is we will never have a state of Palestine, and to ensure that if any country in our region supports the Palestinians, we will overthrow that government, especially if they support a Palestinian armed resistance. So this is where many of the wars in this region have come from. They've come from the partnership of the U.S. neoconservatives and Netanyahu's extremist nationalists. And this is, for example, the Iraq War was heavily promoted by Netanyahu. The war in Syria was promoted by Netanyahu. Why? Because Assad was too close to Iran in this neocon extreme Zionist view. So Assad had to be overthrown. And this was a CIA operation, Operation Timber Sycamore. launched by Obama. It led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and to the current situation in Syria. This is my understanding based on, of course, 30 years of intensive engagement in these issues. And so I regard Netanyahu as properly under indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is very straightforward. Yeah. The idea that any of this remotely has to do with Judaism, to my mind, is both wrong, a little bit bizarre, but of course part of Netanyahu's propaganda, because he wants it to be seen that way, so that if anyone attacks him, he says, oh, that's anti-Semitism. This is, again, another narrative game. This is not substance.
Professor, in Israel, there is a democracy of Western type. Or is there any other type of regime there?
It's a democracy like...
There is no resistance from the opposition about ending the war and...
just a couple of points. First, it's a democracy like South Africa under apartheid was a democracy, which means that you have a democracy for one group and you freely kill...
anyone that opposes.
Threaten, expel, ethnically cleanse the other group. So this is not a democracy. This is an absolutely violent extremist government, period. Second, Netanyahu is reviled inside Israel for different reasons. One is that people see that he doesn't care about the hostages. He cares about continuing the war in Gaza. I don't know how much Israeli public opinion understands or cares about the ultimate justification. He's not fighting Hamas. What he's trying to do is destroy the Palestinian possibility of living in Gaza and having a state. And he just said a few days ago that Israel will permanently occupy Gaza. Any self-respecting country in Europe should have immediately stood up and said, no, you can't do that. But this is Western values. Western values are, kill, crush, expel the Palestinians. If you ask, what are Western values? Those are the true Western values. They're not much for values, but that's the truth. This is part of, this is not opposed broadly by European politicians and still less by American politicians. It's opposed by people on the street. It's opposed by young people. They're aghast at all of this. But it's not opposed by the politicians who say, perfectly natural. You kill 50,000 people straight out, probably double or triple that number because of starvation, deprivation of medical care, and so forth. People buried under the rubble. And that's treated as kind of natural. And head of state visit coming up. I don't buy it.
Professor, I forgot to ask you about the Ukrainian issue, and I go back there. When the war broke out, you remember that in a very short period of time there were peace talks in Turkey, and I heard you saying that you took part or you were invited to advise.
No, not quite.
Can you tell us what happened there and how it all collapsed?
Russia's idea of the special military operation, which started February 24th, 2022, was that Ukraine would rush back to the negotiating table. They were trying to scare the wits out of Ukraine. And they succeeded, because within about a week of the operation, Zelensky started to say publicly, we could be neutral. We could be neutral. And in early March 2022, the Ukrainians actually approached the Russians and said, we could negotiate. And the Russians were surprised, and they said, well, what do you mean? And the Ukrainians produced a document. The document, I know, went to the Russian leadership, and the Russian leadership said, okay, that's a basis for negotiating. And that began what is now called the Istanbul process.
Yes.
The Turks said, we will mediate. There were some other informal mediators like the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, but the negotiations took place from early March through mid-April. On March 28th, Russia and Ukraine issued a joint communique saying we're getting to a solution. The basis of the solution at the time was essentially Ukraine declaring permanent neutrality and a security agreement that was undefined how it would work exactly.
Okay. No guarantees by any third countries or anything?
There were many ideas, and the Ukrainians had some, and the Russians had others. But the main one that Russia said is, we want a role in the security guarantees, and Ukraine said no. And my view is rather straightforward, which is that it should be in the UN Security Council, which gives Russia a role, the United States a role, France and Britain, China, and so on.
And everybody.
But international law, as we discussed. They worked on all of the different aspects of the negotiation up through April 15, and they tabled a draft document. And that document can be found online. For example, the New York Times posted it at one point, and it shows in red what the Russians still object to, and in another what the Ukrainians object to. But basically, it's a nearly completed document. If there was serious intent on both sides, it's the kind of document that you would say, okay, maybe it's another week, maybe it's another 2 weeks, but this is the basis of an agreement. The negotiations stopped at that moment. I flew to Ankara soon after that, so I wasn't involved in any of the negotiations. But I went because I wanted to speak with the Turkish mediators just to understand firsthand what had happened. And what had happened was that one day the Ukrainians told the Turkish mediators, we're not coming back to the negotiating table. That's all. They walked away.
So they backed off?
They walked away. Yes. Now, what we know from many
sources,
witnesses now, including Bennett, is the United States told them to back off. The United States told them, fight on. You don't have to give up your NATO membership. You don't have to accept neutrality. We've got your back.
We've got your back.
That's it. And that is basically, at that point, incidentally, I think the agreement would have been Crimea to Russia and the eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, probably would have stayed Ukrainian, but under the Minsk II agreement terms, under autonomy terms.
Yes, autonomy.
And now Ukraine's never getting that territory back. I'm sorry. I mean, they can fight on, but they'll get destroyed before they get it back. So the terms would have been much better in April 2022 than they are in May 2025. And 1 million lives would have been saved either from death or from serious injury. And I argued every day back in April 2022 and in May and in June, and working at the Vatican and working with everyone that I could find to say, take the peace because it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. Okay, so I got charged with being a friend of Putin, being Putin's puppet, being Putin's propagandist, and so forth. I was the friend of Ukraine. It was Biden who was the enemy of Ukraine. He got the country destroyed in his incompetency. Europe was not the friend of Ukraine. Europe was the enemy of Ukraine. And now because in effect it got Ukraine destroyed. And now the Europeans who say, we stand with Ukraine, you really feel that they just like Ukraine fighting Russia a few hundred kilometers from their own borders. Hey, why not? Keep fighting, keep weakening Russia. They think, just keep them away from our borders. What they can't get into their head is the idea of neutrality. Neutrality is a wonderful thing, by the way. And neutrality kept the peace after World War II. And it's another interesting phenomenon. Who were the most successful countries in Europe after World War II?
Switzerland.
You look at Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Finland. They weren't NATO countries. They were neutral countries. Did they suffer? Did the Russians pick on them? Did the Russians invade them? No, they became rich, fat, and happy. And yet the Americans, up until Trump, hated the idea of neutrality. And now the Europeans, this current generation of leaders can't get it.
Professor, coming towards the end, you know the situation in Cyprus. What would you advise the Cypriots as regards their conflict with Turkey? It's been 50 years now. Of course, we don't have a war or conflict in the meantime. But the island is still divided. Do you have any idea, any perspective that you want to share with us about this?
I was in South Tyrol, Italy recently. South Tyrol is Bolzano and the environs. It's very interesting and relevant for Cyprus. And the reason is that South Tyrol is a minority region, German-speaking minority region, that after World War I became part of Italy rather than of Austria or Germany. And so Italy found itself with a ethnic German minority inside. Well, you can imagine this became quite complicated in World War II and after World War II and for decades onward. And after World War II, the German minority in Italy said, we want autonomy. And the Italians didn't really want to give the Germans autonomy. And they did on paper, but not in reality. And there was violence, there was protest. And then finally an agreement was reached some decades after the end of World War II. And it gave this German-speaking area substantial autonomy. If you go there, and I've been there twice recently because it's a great ski area, so I went skiing, and then we went in the summertime and talked to some of the politicians and some of the public. It's a phenomenal success story. Everybody's happy. The Italians are happy. The German population's happy. The region is booming. It's tourism and all the rest. Now, similarly, I was in another complicated country recently, Belgium, and I spoke to politicians. Belgium has, I think, 6 parliaments. I may be one off. It was much more complicated even than I imagined because I knew, of course, about Flanders and Wallonia and the national capital and the Belgian parliament. That makes 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's another one makes 5. It's 5 or 6. In any event, it works. They created kind of autonomy.
It works and it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, but it does work. It's not a war. There's not a wall. There's not a military occupation. It works rather. Okay, I don't know enough to give detailed advice, but I do know enough to say it's worth solving this problem. And there are 2 ethnicities on this island. And that's been true for hundreds of years. And for much of the time, okay, it's a little complicated. I don't want to oversimplify. But I do want to say it's worth solving this problem. And it requires in some way that each of the communities has some security and protection of its own and has some autonomy of its own. You've got 2 religions here. You have 2 ethnicities, 2 languages, 2 cultures. And a beautiful island. And it should not be beyond the possibility to find a way to be peaceful, demilitarized, and safe on the island together.
Okay, so the final question, your speech tomorrow will be about what?
When it comes to speeches tomorrow, I'll think about that tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay.
No, but honestly, I'm getting an honorary doctorate, and so it's a great, great honor. And so I will express my gratitude. I will discuss some of the issues that we talked about. But the truth is, it is actually the truth. I do not write out my speeches.
Really?
Because I very much believe that speeches are about communication. And to communicate, you need to look into the eyes of the people that you're communicating with. And that's when I give my speech.
Your recent speech at the European Parliament wasn't written, you just...
Yes, not written.
Yes.
In fact, I did not really know exactly the format or where I was going or who would be in the room until I sat down. But then I looked in the eyes and I understood the context, and that's when I like to give a speech.
It's an amazing speech. It's on the internet. The event will be live, and on Saturday you will have another event with our European MP Fidias in the City Hall at 5 o'clock, I think. And that will be broadcasted live.
Wonderful. Yes, I'm excited.
Yes.
It's a great honor.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. We covered a lot of ground. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much.